The winter of 1866 in Colorado began with a sharp, unsettling stillness. Frost clung to wooden boardwalks, chimney smoke hung motionless like an unfinished thought. In Silver Hollow, a mining town crouched between granite walls and fir-black slopes, even the wind seemed to have taken ill. The usual crack of axes in the yards was gone. Doors opened only for moments, enough to spill a thread of heat into the freezing air before slamming shut again. It was in that quiet that the first sound came, not from the sky or the street, but from beneath the frozen ground. A low, deliberate blow, as if the mountain had been struck from within. Men lifted their heads from stoves and workbenches. Women paused at washbasins, hands stiff in icy water. For a moment the whole town seemed to stop breathing. Above the gorge, a cloud of dust burst upward. Snow, mixed with a fine stone powder, drifted over the slope like a gray veil. Those who saw it later said the mountain had spoken, and that people, wise enough to respect it, simply bowed to its will. But that day, something in the sound was wrong, less the voice of stone than the execution of a plan. By nightfall, word spread that the Johnson family was gone. Eli, a Civil War veteran with the limp to prove it, Clara, his wife, and their 4 children, the youngest not yet 5. The official notice in the Territorial Gazette would call it instant death from a collapse, a tidy phrase for a thing that left nothing to bury. Candles were lit in the church windows, and for a night the town spoke in hushed tones. But morning brought the cold back, and the living had to eat. In Silver Hollow, grief was not a luxury the winter allowed. Yet over every hearth and workbench lingered the same name, never spoken too loud, Jared Miller. Miller owned Frontier Mining and Rail, a name printed on the sides of every ore cart and stamped into the wax of every wage slip. He was seen rarely, but his presence weighed on the town like a ledger's unpaid column. And always, near him, the shadow of Cooper Grayson, a former officer whose posture still obeyed military drill. Their visits to the town left no warmth, only the sight of horses steaming in the cold and crates, neat as coffins, stacked on wagons headed out of the gorge. The truth, or what could still be found of it, would take decades to rise. But that morning, while the dust of the collapse still hung in the pine branches, the first thread was already being woven into a long fabric of silence. If you've ever walked Denver streets in late autumn, you know this city wears 2 faces. By day in 1899, the bright clangor of streetcars, the river breathing steam from bricked laundries, the clipped steps of clerks who believe in ledgers more than in prayer. By night, soot-streaked windows, coughs like broken fiddles, and that iron taste the wind carries from rail yards where sparks leap and die. It was into this doubleness that Father Patrick O'Connell stepped on November 3, 1899, carrying a silence that did not belong to him. He had left the hospital at St. Joseph's with his collar loosened and his eyes older. A confession had concluded there, not so much whispered as methodically laid out, like a work shift recorded against time. The penitent had coughed up black crumbs into a linen rag while speaking in dates and intervals. 2 charges at dusk. Then wait. Let the mountain hold its breath, he said, until his lungs could no longer copy the rhythm he described. Coal dust lungs fail as if the body were being buried from the inside. Before the last rattle, he pressed 2 ideas into O'Connell's hands, a set of coordinates, and the phrase, "Safe wait until morning." The priest did not write them down, but the ideas stayed, sharp as a pin in the sole of a boot. He could not break the seal. That law bound him as tightly as any set of cuffs. Yet the streets were public, and what had been described contained objects that leave shadows, warehouses, waybills, the slow dance of money from office to office. He could look then, he could remember. He began with the places no one guards well, margins. In library ledgers he marked the date, December 14, 1866, with a faint cross in the corner of a page and closed the book as if it burned. In the General Land Office, he asked for claim transfers around Silver Hollow in the first quarter of 1867 and found the county's signature pressed into wax that looked a shade too new for its line. At the Territorial Archive, he withdrew Sheriff Barnes's report. The pen strokes were neat, but the language, temporary suspension of rescue operations in the interest of safety. Read like something copied from a circular. He placed the page beside a frontier mining and rail pamphlet on best practices in geological emergencies. The phrasing overlapped like transparent maps. Denver is a city of counters, store counters, bank counters, bar counters. At one of them, O'Connell bought a cheap notebook and a stub of carpenter's pencil. He wrote no names, only signs that would jog memory without accusing paper. A dented seal here, a wrong batch of bond stock there, a docket number that jumped over a missing child, a notice of charity from Jared Miller, funds for a memorial to the dead of Silver Hollow, dispersed 3 weeks after the county transferred the Johnson claim to the company. For the public good. The priest had seen grief made into a halo for benefiting men. He wrote, "Halo used to hide hooks." O'Connell was not popular in the places where the questions he asked had prices attached. He was polite, he did not threaten. Still, bank tills slid shut a minute early when he approached. A clerk in the recorder's office closed the drawer gently, too gently, on a stack of receipts he had just requested. "We keep these by quarter," she said. "But the third quarter's gone to rebinding." He returned the next day and found the same drawer labeled "Under Audit." The city had developed an allergy to his presence. Even the postmaster, an old German who prided himself on punctuality, shifted his stance when O'Connell inquired about delayed mailbags routed to the Silver Hollow station in December '66. "Snow," the man said, then swallowed, as if the word were bigger than weather. "Documents do not speak, they line up." The priest laid them in his mind as he walked, the sheriff's careful sentences, the company's language on controlled detonations, the county minutes showing a quorum the same evening Jared Miller paid for hot soup at the poorhouse. He saw how charity warmed a room and softened questions. He noted how signatures paneled themselves around the same handful of names, as if the county commission had only 4 chairs and those chairs never cooled. A postcard came next, no return address, cheap stock, an engraving of a stag. It waited under the rectory door like a small animal. "You tread where tunnels go," the back read in a tidy hand. "Not all can bear the weight above them." There was no threat, only geologic advice. He put it between pages of a book of hours and left it there, as if prayer might blunt its edge. The first real slip arrived not by providence but because someone was tired. In the basement of the Chronicle, a newspaper that owed nothing to the mining advertisers because it had lost them already, there was a crate of back issues and a stack of county notices misfiled with shipping announcements. Among them lay a single-page, faulted rock report from a consulting geologist, dated December 12, 1866, printed on Wilkes and Barber ivory bond. The Wilkes watermark in the paper's corner had a faint break in the loop of the W. O'Connell had seen that same break on a different document, a company letterhead ordered in 1868, 2 years later. Paper, like men, has a birthday. He held the sheet to the basement bulb, saw the interrupted loop again, and wrote down one word. After. He took a late train to the yards and stood near the loading docks where frontier crates were stamped and shipped. Men who have nothing to hide do not look at priests as if they were customs officers. Yet a foreman, seeing the collar, stopped joking mid-sentence and lit a cigarette he did not want. O'Connell asked about storage, only storage, and received answers that felt printed before they were spoken. "We move on schedule," said the foreman. "Schedules keep men alive." The priest thought of the phrase in the dying man's mouth, "safe wait until morning." He asked what happened when the schedule ran into the mountains moods. The cigarette burned down to paper. "We suspend and assess," the man said, then coughed the way men cough who live at the edge of powder. At the orphanage on 19th Street, an old sister remembered the Johnson children's names. "We prayed them into the ground," she said, then corrected herself. "Into God's hands?" There was no ground to open. She had kept a ribbon from a donation box sent after the collapse, a narrow strip of gray silk with the frontier mark, tied around candles that arrived too late to be of use. "They were fine candles," she added, as if that detail could redeem lateness. It is a strange thing to feel watched in a city of thousands. Yet the sensation settled itself into O'Connell's coat like cold. A man remained too long at a corner newsstand after buying nothing. A clerk's reflection in a glass door aligned itself with his steps, then broke off. One evening, as he pushed open the archives gate, he heard a soft scuff behind him, the sound of a boot testing gravel without committing to it. He turned. Only the wind moved, lifting a scrap of paper across the yard. The scrap was an invoice face down. He found Tom Harper's name by accident, if accidents are only the moments when two lines finally meet. In a list of unpaid county bills from 1867, Harper T. Forged repairs appeared beside. Temporary supports, west shaft. A blacksmith's hands carry a history in their nail beds. Silver Hollow had been a 2-day journey even when the passes were clear. Now winter was rising again, and the mountain towns would soon be islands. He took the next day's coach anyway, carrying a spare collar, a notebook, and the kind of determination that looks, from a distance, like foolishness. The road unwound into shale and fir. With each mile, Denver's brass fell away. The driver spat into the snow and called the peaks by the names the old hands used: Old Mother, Three Tooth, the Sleeping Ox, and warned that storms learn maps better than men. At a wayside station, the priest warmed his hands over coffee that tasted of metal and smoke. On the wall, a faded timetable listed a spur line that had never been built. Frontier Mining and Rail had promised it the year after the collapse, then rerouted funding to charitable initiatives. The proprietor laughed without mirth when O'Connell pointed. "Rails go where the bosses eat," he said. Town folks were meant to be grateful for the promise. He reached Silver Hollow near dusk. Towns that survive on ore learn to keep their heads down in winter. Smoke rose straight up from low roofs. The church door hung on a leather strap. The general store's sign creaked and stopped, like a clock that measures wind. The mine scar above the gorge had grown over in brush, the way wounds scab. In the street, a boy dragged a sled with a crate on it, the kind Frontier used for fuses. It was empty, and the hollow sound of it bumping boardwalk knotted the priest's stomach. Tom Harper's forge stood at the edge of town, near the creek whose ice had cracked and refrozen until the surface looked like leaded glass. Harper was not a talker. He had iron dust in the webs of his hands and a gaze that moved from anvil to door to stranger's face in the rhythm of a habit long practiced. O'Connell introduced himself without asking for trust he had not earned. He spoke of the West Shaft only to the degree a man can speak without naming what he cannot reveal. Harper listened with his jaw set, then turned to a shelf and took down a tin box whose lid bore the burn of a coal that had fallen there 15 years earlier. Inside, charred half-scraps of paper, a note from C.G. No full name, about a visit, around noon, crude depth sketches and tick marks that recorded strikes on stone. 23, then a pause, 16 more, a gap, 8, a long gap, 12. The cadence of human arms, not a mountain failing on its own. The blacksmith did not accuse. He set the box on the anvil and tapped its lid once with a hammer, as if to seal a decision already made. When the priest reached for the papers, Harper laid one finger on the corner of a torn flyer beneath them. The flyer announced a monument to the deceased, with the company name neat at the bottom and a list of subscription amounts printed like virtue. Next to it, a deed, county to company, dated January 3, 1867, transferring the Johnson claim, in the interest of public benefit. Harper's mouth flattened. "Public," he said, as if the word itself tasted like metal. They spoke into the evening, and what they said would not fit into a single sentence in any court, only into the slow accrual of details that, laid end to end, begin to resemble a road. The priest matched the tick marks to the dying man's timetable and felt the back of his neck go cold. Numbers, when they align, do not care about sorrow. They only indicate force applied and time allowed. "Somebody waited," Harper said finally, staring into the forge's dull glow. "Waited for morning that never carried rescue, only explanation." He tapped the box again, softer. "You'll want the rest. I'll not say it, but I'll point." Then, because men must live after they point, he added, "Mind your step among the crates." The road into Silver Hollow had a way of discouraging the curious. In autumn, the narrow pass could be made by wagon, By early winter, ice turned the descent into a test of will. Father O'Connell reached it in the final week of November 1899, with a gray sleet gnawing at the ridges and a wind that made the pines sound like whispering in a long hallway. His horse labored on the last incline, hooves slipping on the polished frost of stone. The town revealed itself suddenly, not as a bustling mining hub, but as something that had folded inward. A sagging mercantile sign creaked in the wind. The blacksmith's yard was half buried in snow, forge cold. The post office window was clouded from within, its glass warped with age. Above it all, to the east, the scar of the old mine lay like an open wound, brush grown over the lip of the crater but not enough to hide its shape. O'Connell carried with him the confession from Denver, the dying man's voice that had spoken of dynamite timed, for after the lamps went out, of schedules, to wait for morning, of certain names to be kept from paper. That testimony, bound by the seal of confession, could never be spoken openly, but it could direct his eyes. The man he had come to see lived in a one-room cabin on the edge of town, near the frozen creek. Tom Harper had once been the town's blacksmith. Age and an old injury had twisted his hands. His knuckles were knotted, the fingers curled as though still gripping a hammer. He was not known for storytelling, but for keeping things others preferred to forget. Harper did not speak of the Johnson family's deaths outright. Instead, he fetched a dented tin box from beneath his cot and set it on the table between them. Inside lay scraps of charred paper, edges blackened but words still legible in parts. Visit around noon, depth to be achieved before dusk, marking in 3 intervals as agreed. There were crude pencil sketches of shaft tunnels, marked with depths and angles, and beside them, a torn flyer announcing a charity drive for a monument to the deceased of the 1866 collapse, bearing the seal of Frontier Mining and Rail. Beneath it, a county deed transferring the claim, in the interest of public benefit, to the same company. One slip of paper drew O'Connell's attention more than the rest, a small sheet covered with parallel tick marks. The spacing was irregular, grouped in clusters. Harper explained in a flat voice that he had made them in December 1866, sitting outside the mine mouth, counting each strike of metal he could hear between the gusts of wind. It wasn't rock falling, Harper said. It was hammering. Steady, like someone trying to cut their way out. Went on through the night. Slowed after dawn. The priest compared those marks to the Denver Confession's mention of signals returned for hours after the main blast, and felt the alignment click into place. The confession had given the coordinates of the shaft. Harper's marks gave it sound. They spoke until the light failed. Harper never accused anyone directly, he pointed, and let the paper speak. The message in those scraps was simple. The collapse had been neither sudden nor total, and the company's rescue delay had not been dictated by safety alone. O'Connell left the cabin with the tin box wrapped in oilcloth under his arm. The sleet had turned to snow, fine and dry, settling into the prints his boots had left on the way in. Each step back toward town felt heavier. The silence here was not absence of sound, it was ownership, cultivated, protected, profitable. And he knew, as the wind carried the smell of coal from some unseen stove, that breaking that silence would mean crossing the same shadow that had stretched from 1866 to this very night. Snow fell in a slow, deliberate pattern over Denver, turning the rooftops into ledgers that no hand had yet balanced. Father O'Connell returned from Silver Hollow with the tin box under his coat, its weight not in metal but in implication. Each scrap of paper was a coin minted in the currency of guilt, and in Denver's winter air, guilt was a commodity few dared to trade. He began in the smallest offices, the ones tucked between warehouses where coal dust turned the floorboards black. Land records first. The county's formal transfer of the Johnson claim in January 1867, signed by 3 commissioners, 2 of whom appeared also on Frontier Mining and Rail's list of charitable donors. The donation amounts were identical, to the dollar, to the figures noted in the company's end-of-year profit reports. Next, the banking archives. A ledger at Fourth National Bank showed consulting fees paid in December 1866 to 1C. Grayson, the same month, the same name, as on a Frontier internal memo regarding Blast pattern optimization. No details were given. The entry was written in the banker's tidy hand, the columns aligning too perfectly to be honest. O'Connell laid the scraps from Harper's tin beside these newer finds. The tick marks matched the confession's timeline. The visit around noon matched a sheriff's report that curiously failed to note the sheriff's own presence on site. Sheriff Barnes had signed that report with his usual flourish, the same flourish he used on Miller's campaign endorsement the following year. In the reading rooms of the Territorial Archive, the priest examined geological surveys. One report, ostensibly from 1866, was printed on Wilkes and Barber ivory bond, the same post-1868 stock he had already identified in the Chronicle basement. That survey declared, "Faulted rock, high collapse risk," precisely at the coordinates of the Johnson shaft. But Harper's sketches showed no such fault, and the Denver confession described solid rock, intentionally breached. Patterns emerged, not in isolation but in repetition. Temporary suspension of rescue appeared in 3 different documents from 3 different hands, the phrasing identical down to the prepositions. In the interest of safety was the shield. Behind it, Harper's marks told of unanswered hammer blows in the dark. As O'Connell's notes thickened, so did the resistance. One afternoon, he arrived at the courthouse to find the archive room locked. For inventory. At the recorder's office, a clerk misplaced the volume he had requested, only to find it again 2 days later with a corner torn away, precisely where the commissioner's signature had been. A warehouse foreman he questioned about December 1866 shipments suddenly transferred out of state the next week. The shadow following him had grown bolder. Footsteps on a stair behind him in the evening, the same bootprint outside his boarding room on 2 separate mornings, a folded scrap of paper left on his chair in the rectory. "Your hands are too clean for that box." But the system's very precision betrayed it. A note from Frontier's office, dated the day after the collapse, spoke of resumption of operations upon confirmation of stability by consulting engineer. The consulting engineer's signature was Grayson's. The same day, Barnes had filed his report declaring no survivors. That sequence, consultation, confirmation, closure, was neat enough to serve as a model for corporate crisis management. Only it wasn't a model, it was the original. O'Connell visited a retired telegraph operator who had worked the Silver Hollow line in 1866. The old man, half-deaf now, remembered that in the hours after the collapse, the wire had carried a flurry of coded company messages. 3 longs, 2 shorts, repeated, he said. Not a mining code he knew, but Harper's tick marks came in clusters of 3 then 2. The priest understood the danger of holding enough evidence to connect those marks to a timed blast, and enough names to prove it wasn't nature's work. The tin box was no longer simply an artifact. It was a live charge, waiting for the right spark. In mid-December 1899, a break came from an unlikely source, a junior clerk at the Denver Chronicle who, seeing O'Connell at the counter again, quietly slipped him a folded page torn from a printer's proof. It was an unprinted obituary draft for Cooper Grayson, not dead yet, but gravely ill. The draft described him as former operations overseer for Frontier Mining and Rail, and recipient of county commendations for rescue coordination during the 1866 Silver Hollow disaster. Commendations that, in O'Connell's growing dossier, now read like bribes paid in public view. The timing was critical. If Grayson died before the truth emerged, he would become another untouchable name carved in stone. If Miller caught wind of the investigation, the remaining documents would vanish as surely as the men who had tried to speak before. That night, O'Connell drafted a plan in his notebook. Step 1. Secure duplicates of every scrap, ledger entry, and map in his possession. Step 2. Get them into the hands of someone not bound by the seal of confession, someone who could print without asking permission. Step 3. Act before Christmas, when offices would shutter and the town's attention would turn inward. The Chronicle's editor, a wiry man named Horace Vail, had already earned the enmity of Denver's business elite for refusing to run paid puff pieces. He had a taste for the documentary, a love of numbered evidence over florid accusation. When O'Connell spread the papers across Vale's desk, the editor's eyes narrowed the way they do when a man recognizes not just a story, but a war. Names? Vale asked. Dates first, O'Connell said. Then names. Let them tie their own knots. They worked in the back office until dawn, cross-checking every figure, matching every phrase that appeared in both company circulars and official reports. In the cold light of morning, the pattern was undeniable: a collapse plan to clear a claim, rescue delayed until the deed was signed, a monument raised to the victims with the same funds that had ensured their silence in death. The next move would fracture the surface of Denver's winter calm. The Chronicle would not accuse. It would publish the raw coordinates, the tick-mark timings, the payment records. It would let the shape form in the reader's mind, because once seen, it could not be unseen. O'Connell left the office with the snow now falling in thick sheets, each flake settling over a city that did not yet know it was about to remember what it had tried to forget for 33 years. Newsprint has its own winter smell: wet cotton, lye, and metal warm just enough to wake the ink. In the Chronicle's back room, Vale fed paper like a gambler sliding chips, and O'Connell read the proofs aloud, his voice low, each number struck as if a bell. The plan was simple because it had to be: print before anyone with money could ask what was being made, mail duplicates beyond Colorado, leave copies where even a broom couldn't reach. The first danger arrived as courtesy. A man in a sable collar came to the counter with a paid announcement about a children's charity ball. His ring gleamed like a new coin. "And we should discuss advertiser relations," he told Vale, his smile aimed at the typed cases, not at a face. Vale pretended not to notice the ring, or the card slid under the blotter: Frontier Mining and Rail, Special Accounts. When the man left, the editor lifted the blotter, read the card once, then tore it neatly in half and in half again. "That," he said, "was your last quiet hour." They moved quickly. At the post office, O'Connell bought stamps by the sheet and wrapped packets for Pittsburgh, Chicago, San Francisco, papers Miller couldn't believe by luncheon. He addressed one to the Attorney General and another to a federal mining inspector whose name he had copied from a conference notice 2 summers old. Each packet contained the same skeleton: coordinates, tick-mark transcript, bank entries, Wilkes and Barber watermark notes, the deed with the convenient date. "If one packet is intercepted," Vale said, binding twine like a sailor, "another learns to swim." Resistance sharpened. The Chronicle's compositor found his lock-up frame unbolted and the slug spelling Miller gone from the typed galley. It reappeared later inside a spool of wire, slick with oil. A delivery boy was tripped on the pressroom stairs. No accident, the priest thought, when the hand that steadied him belonged to the same man who had tried to sell the charity ad. On his way back from the telegraph, O'Connell saw crates marked fuse stacked unusually high behind Frontier's Denver warehouse. A watchman leaned in the doorway, warming his palms not over a brazier but above a ledger, as if the numbers themselves gave heat. The press was scheduled for midnight. They'd lock the for me at 11, pull 100 advance sheets for posting by dawn, then run the full edition on the morning cycle. Vale kept a revolver in the bottom drawer, wrapped in newspaper older than some of his apprentices. "For show," he said. "I prefer ink." Nevertheless, he laid it on the desk as if it were a paperweight. 2 errands remained. First, the original of Harper's tin box flyer, the monument to the deceased, with the Frontier seal, had to be photographed at Lutz's studios so the paper could reproduce the seal without accusation of forgery. Second, the priest had to ride out to a retired notary whose embossing tool had marked half the county's transactions in the 1860s. If the man confirmed that the Johnson deed bore his former apprentice's pressure, not his own, a margin note could become a headline. Sleet turned to glass that afternoon. O'Connell took the shorter road along the river, faster, more exposed. Halfway to the notary's cabin, a wagon without team stood crossways in the track, load tarped, wheels braced. No driver. The priest dismounted and walked the ditch line, listening. The world made the tiny sounds of a hell breath: ice straining on branches, a far coal scoop, the river's slow grind. When he reached to check the wagon's harness hooks, A gloved hand detached itself from the tarpaulin's shadow and closed on his wrist, not to strike, but to hold him there, weightlessly, like a specimen. Another man stepped from behind the brush with a smile already arranged on his face. "Father," he said, using the title as if tasting it. "Road's poor. Worse if one blocks it," O'Connell answered, and the gloved hand loosened the smallest fraction. The smiling man wore a country coat over a city waistcoat. The combination never means thrift, it means message. "Frontier," O'Connell said, not as a question. "What matters isn't the name," the man replied. "It's the schedule." He looked past the priest at the river ice. "Some currents don't care who rows." He did not threaten the chronicle. He did not mention the packets. He described, instead, the misery of a winter mine, the cost of panic, the way a rumor can empty a shaft. "You'll save no lives," he said. "You'll cost them." Then he stepped aside and nodded to the hand under the tarp. The path opened with a small, absurd courtesy. The priest rode on with his heart beating as if it were trying to count something it could not see. The notary was waiting with a cat on his lap and a cup of tea that had forgotten heat. He was old enough to remember when signatures were made with effort and sealing wax could reveal a man's nerves. He took the deed in both hands, squinted at the pressure on the paper fibers. "Apprentice work," he grunted. "See here, the arc bites shallow at the top of the O, heavy at the tail. That boy pressed like he was afraid of breaking the die." He wrote a statement in a practiced, slanted hand, folded it into an envelope, and pressed his own seal over the flap. "If they want my bones for this, they'll be bored," he said. "Most of me's already in the ground." By 9 o'clock, the Chronicle smelled of oil and resolve. Young Mr. Lutz ran in with the photograph, breath painting the cold. The seal's tiny imperfections showed clearly in the plate. The same hairline nick in the rim that appeared on a charity ribbon in the orphanage and on a payment receipt for dynamite delivered 2 days before the collapse. In the piece's margins, Vale's pencil marched, not accusation, iteration. Then the lights went out. Not the city's. Only the Chronicle's. The press stopped mid-revolution with a soft shudder, the way a heart might pause before deciding. In the black, someone knocked a chair over. Vale swore. O'Connell felt his way toward the window, palms hitting the cold glass. Outside, the street lamps burned steady. Inside, a shadow moved not toward the door but toward the Fermi, toward the physic body of the story. The priest went low and hit the man behind the knees with all the clumsy force a scholar can muster. They went down in a tumble against the stone. Hands found shirt, collar, a scarf that smelled of tobacco stronger than Denver grows. Then the shadow tore free and ran. By the time Vale reached the door with the revolver, the street was empty except for a cart's wheels scoring the slush. "Fused by the junction box," the compositor said, voice shaking. "Cut clean." They worked by lamplight, useless as it was for a machine that wanted current. Vale sent an apprentice to wake the electric man. O'Connell stood over the Fermi as if it were a sleeping child. An hour later, the current returned. The press took breath, juddered, caught the rhythm. Advance sheets slid like tongues of winter fog across the table. The first proof carried a smear. The second, a perfect line of type where 3 dates, December 12, 13, 14, stacked like steps down a shaft. They posted broadsides at dawn, courthouse door, railroad depot, the corner by the bank. Boys with sacks took bundles to hotels where men read over coffee they did not taste. Vale mailed the packets with special handling and sent 2 by hired rider to avoid the bags entirely. One sealed copy went into a bank box with a letter, to be opened if Patrick O'Connell is harmed. Miller's machine stirred. The company paid for full columns and competing papers, words like irresponsible, slanderous, priestly interference. The sheriff issued a statement reminding citizens of his long-standing commitment to public safety. A committee of businessmen called for civic calm and continued investment. But men carried the Chronicle folded under their arms like a second spine, and in the saloons the talk shortened as facts replaced rumor. Names were said at regular volume. In Silver Hollow, word traveled by stove. By evening, miners read the reprinted tick marks aloud and tapped them on tabletops with spoon handles. 23 pause, 16 pause, 8 long pause, 12. A widow who had been a girl in 66 went to the monument and laid a glove on the stone. Not prayer, not curse, proof of being there. By nightfall, someone pried the county commission's minute book from its shelf and discovered that a page, January 3, 1867, had been glued to the binding along its inner edge, as if meant to be read at a distance. A thin knife freed it. Beneath, another page showed an earlier draft with different language, not public benefit, but emergency caretaking. The change had been made later, by a hand that favored neatness over truth. The machine had planned for rails and judges and ads. It had not planned for a rhythm counted in the dark by a blacksmith with no one to impress and for a priest who could not quote his source but could point until others spoke. The race was never to outrun men like Miller. It was to outrun the hour when winter makes people forgive anything as long as the stove stays warm. At midnight, with the second run nearly done, a telegram clattered in from the state capitol. The district attorney, lately inert, requested that all relevant documents be secured against destruction. He would, he wrote, be arriving without delay. Vale laughed, not kindly. The man has discovered verbs. Then he turned serious. They will come before he does. They did. And that belongs to the night after, when the press had cooled and the lamps burned low, and the door opened not to the law but to men who wore the law's patience like a borrowed coat. When the Chronicle's morning edition hit Denver's streets, the city moved as though a frost had crept under its doors. The lead column was unadorned, no rhetoric, no accusation. Just numbers, dates, maps, and the staccato rhythm of Harper's tick marks printed beside the timetable of Grayson's controlled detonation memo. In black ink, the gap between last hammer and first rescue was measured in hours long enough to chill the breath. The reaction was immediate and uneven. Some read in silence, folding the paper slowly as if to hide it. Others carried it into taverns, slapping the broadsheet on counters with a wet smack. Look! Read! At the bank on Larimer, a teller dropped his pen when a customer asked whether the name in the ledger matched the one on page 4. By noon, whispers crossed from street to street. Miller knew. Barnes signed. Grayson drew the shaft himself. Frontier's headquarters closed its doors. For inventory. Men in company coats walked in, but none emerged. That same afternoon, O'Connell noticed two strangers at the far end of the Chronicle's alley, either smoking nor speaking, just watching the back entrance as if time itself were their employer. Vale barred the rear door and told the apprentices to take the front in pairs. By evening, the paper had reached Silver Hollow. The miners there read the marks aloud in the boarding house. 23 pause, 16 pause, 8 long pause, 12, tapping them out on tabletops. A widow who had been a girl in 66 walked to the monument and left a single work glove on the stone. No speech, no prayer. Proof enough. The system's counterblow was as methodical as the blast it once timed. The Denver Herald, flush with frontier advertising, printed an editorial denouncing the dangerous resurrection of slanderous tales and warning of panic-induced layoffs. The sheriff issued a statement reminding citizens that speculation is no substitute for official record. But even he could not answer why the official record had been printed on the wrong year's paper stock. That night, as O'Connell crossed Arapahoe Street toward the boarding house, a wagon rolled to a slow stop beside him. The driver, a man in a city coat over a miner's shirt, spoke without looking down. "It's not too late to step aside, Father. Paper burns faster than coal." The wagon moved on before he could answer, wheels hissing in the slush. In the Chronicle's press room, the tension tightened into something visible. Vale worked with his revolver laid openly beside the ink tray. "It's not for shooting," he told the priest. "It's for telling them we expect them." At midnight, the street door rattled hard enough to shake the glass. When Vale opened it, 3 men stood framed in the lamplight, hats low, coats stiff with frost. "We've come for the box," the tallest said. "You've come to the wrong address," Vale replied. "Then we'll find the right one." the man said, eyes shifting to O'Connell. Soon. They didn't push inside, not yet. They left with a quietness that was worse than any shouted threat. O'Connell knew they would search for the tin box in the rectory, perhaps the notary's home, perhaps Harper's cabin. Every piece of evidence now had to be guarded as if it were a living witness. The next day, the retaliation turned to sabotage. The telegraph wire from the Chronicle's office to the post was cut. 2 packets bound for out-of-state papers never arrived. Vale hired riders to carry replacements by night. O'Connell carried the originals of Harper's papers to the church vault, locking them in a drawer behind altar silver and parish records. Late in the week, news came from the state capital. The district attorney was en route, bringing orders to impound all documents relevant to the matter. Whether that meant protection or disappearance, no one could say. The company's men would likely arrive first. And so, on the last night before the law could intervene, the Chronicle kept every lamp lit, printing until the presses rattled the walls. Every copy that left the building carried not only the story but a fragment of the proof, a photograph of the deed, a facsimile of the tick marks, the Wilkes and Barbara watermark. If the originals vanished, the shadows they cast would remain in hundreds of hands. Sometime after 3 a.m, the alley door creaked again. This time there was no knock. They came just before dawn, boots whispering on frost, the alley filling with the slow exhale of horses. A pry bar kissed the rear jamb. The Chronicle's door gave with the sigh of old wood. Vale's pistol never fired. It didn't need to. A dozen men barged into a room already loud with machinery and brighter than a chapel at Easter. "Take the plates," their leader barked. O'Connell had slept on a stack of news bundles, collar open, eyes raw. He rose without drama, stepped between the intruders and the press, and simply rang the hand bell for copy boys. From the stairwells and the loft, apprentices poured like coal down a chute, each carrying a wrapped bundle. The men reached for the press bed. Vale showed his palms, then pointed to the windows, to the street where dawn grayned. "You can steal a press," he said. "But the town is already reading." They flipped drawers, tore galleys, found only blanks and ruined slugs. The proofs, those fragile links between light and paper, were already gone, parceled into bakers' sacks and hat boxes, sent at midnight to churches and barbers and boarding houses. In the vault behind altar silver, Harper's ticks lay quiet as seeds. The men left with something, of course. They always do. A platen roller. A box of type. 3 photographs without captions. Enough to report success to whoever waited on the other end of the budget. But outside, boys were hawking the second edition, breath pluming. "Collapse that wasn't," they shouted. "Maps! Names!" The district attorney arrived at noon with a deputy and a conscience newly polished by public scrutiny. He sealed the Chronicle's office, then unsealed it 5 hours later under pressing civic need. He took testimony at a borrowed desk, his pen juddering when O'Connell recited times and seals aloud like litanies. Sheriff Barnes presented himself in uniform and insisted on cooperation. When shown the donation ledgers, he turned the color of old milk and requested counsel. News travels in 2 directions, down the slopes with gossip, up the steps with petitions. By the week's end, a procession of widows from Silver Hollow stood in the Capitol's lobby, shawls stiff with cold, kerchiefs tied tight. They did not weep. They named their dead, then named the sound they remembered from the night of the blast. Tock, 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 a stubborn human rhythm beneath the earth. The clerk wrote percussive echoes with a flourish. O'Connell crossed it out and wrote hammering. Grayson did not live to see arraignment. The former officer died in a sanatorium outside Pueblo, lungs eaten by dust and something he called clarity. In his nightstand they found diagrams of the Silver Hollow shaft and an invoice list with 2 words circled in a shaking hand: safe wait. His widow refused to claim him. His effects became exhibits. For Jared Miller, the fall was not theatrical. It was administrative. Credit narrowed, then fled. A board whispered about temporary separation, then published it. The governor, who had once sought Miller's money, now sought daylight. The courts obliged. A grand jury returned indictments that read like a timetable in reverse: fraud, conspiracy, negligent homicide, bribery. "I kept a dangerous business productive," Miller told the court, voice level, vest immaculate. "I trusted experts." The prosecutor lifted the deed transferring the Johnson claim, the notary's seal glinting like ice. "You trusted Prophet," he said. Barnes resigned before the jury could return. He left behind a badge with a crack through the star, a rented room, and 3 letters of recommendation he had written for himself but never sent. The county hired a new sheriff who wore plain coats and walked to work. O'Connell did not testify about the dying man's confession. He could not. Instead, he spoke of boxes, ink, habits, and the unnatural smoothness of a half-decade of accidents around one company's schedule. Vail testified with printer's hands held high so the jury could see the nicks. Tom Harper traveled down from Silver Hollow and placed his tin box on the rail. When he unfolded the char, black edges, chalk ticks pale as bone dust, the courtroom went silent in that peculiar way only workrooms and churches achieve. The verdicts did not satisfy all. They never do. Miller was convicted on the counts that required no imagination and acquitted of the one that would have satisfied grief. He went to prison not as a murderer but as a thief of public trust. For some, that distinction tasted like metal. Yet consequences multiplied in places where verdicts seldom reach. The state ordered independent assays after any collapse with loss of life. Rescue stoppages required multiple signatures recorded in public minutes. Companies were barred from purchasing claims within 30 days of a declared disaster. 2 legislators called it panic. 3 miners in the gallery, hats in hand, called it time. Up in the valley, a cooperative formed, a rough word in the mouth, but sturdy. They rented tools from one another, shared meals, argued about everything except the number of lamps lit before a shift. In the schoolhouse, a teacher showed children the page with the ticks and taught them to count by pauses, not by numbers. "This," she told them, tapping the longest gap, "is what silence looks like." A stone maker came through with a wagon and cut a block from the ridge above the old shaft. The monument he raised was undecorated, no angel, no scrollwork. Just names and the phrase "buried alive," whose cries went unanswered. Men left gloves there after work. Women left lamp wicks. When wind came down the pass, the flame tips bowed, then lifted, as if remembering the old rhythm beneath. What of the priest and the paper? O'Connell returned to baptisms and last rites, to ledger columns of souls instead of ore. He kept, in his top drawer, a clipping stained with oil, the first front page creased where his thumb had worried it. Vail replaced the broken roller, then the whole press. He paid the apprentices a penny extra on nights the lamps burned past 2. Sometimes, on his way back from the poorhouse, O'Connell would pause on the ridge above the city where smoke and law and appetite mingle. He would think of the Johnson children and of the hammering that grew faint, then failed, and he would wonder, not whether evil ends, but whether it ever truly begins anew. Or whether it is the same old accounting, written on fresh paper each generation, waiting for someone to notice the mismatched stock. Winter came again. The mountains wore their old white. When the wind cut just right, carrying the dry rasp of fir and the far clank of rail, the valley seemed to listen. And from the mute mouth of the sealed shaft there rose, or seemed to rise, a sound like counting. Not numbers. Remembrance. A measured vow that carried across the ice, "We heard you."